And welcome to Smart Money Simplified with your host, Brent Mekosh. Brent, good to be with you again. Fascinating lineup you've got for us.
Bill, it's always great seeing you. And I got to tell you, today I'm really excited about this conversation for a couple reasons. First, full disclosure, one of our guests, Paul Perry, happens to be my father-in-law. So it's a man that I love dearly, and I love the work that he does. And I'm thrilled that I get to share it with my audience. And we're also joined by Raymond Moody. Now, what we're going to talk about today is basically this. In my financial world, in my business world, I've got a real privilege to walk alongside people as they determine, what it is they're trying to accomplish in their life, what their values, what their goals are. In many cases, what comes next. But there's a couple questions I definitely can't answer. One is, where are we from? And the next one is, where are we going?
Right.
And between those two questions, there may not be two guys around today that have spent more time focused on this than Raymond and Paul. And they've done, I think, 5 New York Times bestsellers together. They've sold millions of books. They're both viewed, Raymond in his medical career, and of course my father-in-law Paul as a writer, are preeminent in their field, really discussing what happens after we die. And so I guess we'll kind of start with that. And it's a big question to ask, and maybe a little too big a question to start a podcast with. But both you guys, thank you so much for joining me. And I guess I'll put it to you, Raymond. Where do we start with this question?
Well, where I started was I was not religious as a kid, and still am not. I was an astronomy buff. So I went to the University of Virginia at age 18 to study astronomy. And the idea of an afterlife was to me a premise of a comic. I had no idea anybody took it seriously. But I took a philosophy course, and my first day, and just literally the first few days of my philosophy course, reading Plato's Republic, I got hooked on philosophy because it begins with Socrates, who's then about 20 years old. He's walking down to the port city, and on the way down, he meets a man who's probably 60, 70, 80. And Socrates knows him, and he stops, and Socrates says, Kephalos, I'm young now, but I may get how, the age you are. And how does life look from the stance of somebody your age? And Kephalos says, well, Socrates, I've been very successful in my life. I inherited quite a bit of money, but I've added to it, and I've done very well in my business. And I've spent my life focusing on my business affairs. And he said, but just in the last couple of years, he said, it's like my mind starts going back to these stories about the afterlife that I heard when I was a kid. And is there anything like that? And he said, and I developed a sense of urgency about it. Now, the dialogue goes on for another couple of hundred or 180 pages. And then it comes to an end in this incredible scene about a warrior named who was believed dead on the battlefield, but revived during his funeral. And he came back, set up on the funeral pyre, and he told his the people around that he had gotten out of his body. He went through a passageway into another world, and he saw all these things. And so I was curious about that. And Plato obviously took it seriously. He thought that this was an indicator of an afterlife. I talked to my professor, Professor Hammond, about it. He said, yeah, these early Greek philosophers knew of cases who were people who were believed dead and had these experiences. Flash forward about 2.5 years, I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, who had had such an experience when he was a young man. As I continued to study this as an undergraduate, became a philosophy professor, um, and heard about this from my philosophy students and my colleagues. Went to medical school for cases, even in patients I've treated myself. And so that was the process, Brett, whereby I came to this process where, can you logically say, as a logical inference, that there's an afterlife? Not yet. But I think that the reason is more in the limitation of logic than in the limitation of these experiences. And where I've come on it is that I just have to give up. I can't think my way out of this. I just, it appears to me that what this adds up to is that these people are telling us about the afterlife. It's not the oxygen deprivation to the brain. That's what you hear. The difficulty with that is that the bystanders who are not ill or injured at the death of someone else will very commonly report these same things we hear from people with near-death experiences. They get out of their bodies, they rise upward, they into a tunnel, they see a comforting light, they see their life in review, they are met by departed relatives and friends. Then they come back to their bodies, and this is a very transformative experience on people, as we know now, not from my work published in 75, from a host of other physicians now who've investigated this.
You bring up a really excellent point in terms of people that, not the person that's actually dying, that not that near death experience, but that shared death experience. And before we go into one of the reasons I'm thrilled that you're both taking the time to have this conversation today is you've got a new book that's been out for now less than 2 weeks. It is Proof of Life After Life, 7 Reasons to Believe that There is an Afterlife. And it's really focused on proof outside of just a subjective experience that the person that had that near-death experience had, people around them that in a variety of different ways shared in this process. But before we dive into the book and some of the things that you've learned through this book, which I've read pretty much all of them that you have, this one's, I think, really definitive in terms of aggregating all the work that you've done together. Paul, how did you get in touch with Raymond initially? Because it's interesting. This is kind of, there's been stories about this going back to Plato, as you mentioned, Doctor. But now we're kind of coming back into this after what seems like a long hiatus, not talking about these kind of experiences.
Yeah. Well, 33 years ago, I knew nothing of Raymond Moody and nothing of near-death experiences. I was editing in New York a major health magazine called American Health. And I was approached by my book agent, who is also Raymond's book agent, but I didn't know him at the time. And he said, would you like to help Raymond Moody write a book on all the research that's taken place since he wrote his groundbreaking Life After Life? And I said, I don't know who Raymond Moody is. And he said, well, he's the guy who named and defined the near-death experience. I said, I don't know what that is. And Nat, our agent, said, don't you watch Oprah? He's on Oprah all the time. They talk about it a lot. And so I decided to go ahead and work on this book with Raymond. And Raymond was living in Georgia at the time. I went down. I thought it was going to be the only book I would ever write on it, that I would learn everything I could about the subject, do the best job I could on the book. And Raymond and I just took a real liking to each other. And Raymond is a wonderful teacher. So it didn't matter how dumb the question was, he would answer it and take it seriously. And after writing that book, I started to see places where there wasn't research. I started to see vacuums, if you will, in the research. So I talked to Raymond. One of them was about children and near-death experiences. And I asked Raymond, is anyone doing research on children and NDEs? And he said, yeah, there's a pediatrician in Seattle that's starting research on it, a guy named Melvin Morse. So I flew to Seattle, and we produced the book called Closer to the Light, which is a book about children and near-death experiences. And to show you how this subject was thought of by the publishing business, I have to shut that off. Sorry. I wrote a book proposal, and we sent it out for Closer to the Light, sent it out to 20 book publishers. 19 of them rejected it. And one picked it up, and that was Diane Reverend, who was at the time an editor of Random House. And I was sitting there reading all my rejection letters while I spoke to her on the phone. And she said, if you handle this book right, it's going to be an enormous bestseller. And I said, oh, great. I had my doubts because I was reading the rejections. And there's a lesson in all that, because we went ahead and did the book. It ended up on Oprah 3 times.
Yeah.
And, became a massive bestseller. and really launched my career, because then I started looking at every book I would write and look for the vacuum, look for the empty spot. And that's what I've done now for 15 books. I've
So
made
Brent,
it a point to always write a book, with the exception of one book, with a medical doctor or with someone who's a researcher, because I want the books to be solid medical advice, solid medical evidence.
I think that's what makes your books unique is, again, you are looking at through somewhat of a clinical eye. And I guess, Raymond, for those of us that maybe are not in the NDE or near-death experience world, what is this? What are we talking about on a fundamental level?
Basically, what we now know, I wrote about this in 1975, it was published, and at that time, this was not known to the public. But basically, since the advent of cardiopulmonary resuscitation back in the 60s, that experience that Plato described, which was very rare, has now become very common. So I gathered all these stories. My initial group was about 150 people that I had interviewed. And what I found was a remarkable similarity in these stories. And it's not independent of what people's religion might have been, or what cause they almost died from, or their educational background, all these different things. The people had the same experience. And basically, not everybody had the same details. It was about the 15 common elements, see, and one person may have 4 or 5 or 6 of these. One person may have 9 or 10. And rare cases where the person was in these extremely lengthy cardiac arrests that don't make medical sense, I acknowledge. Like my friend who was pronounced dead for 40 minutes. And the doctor told me, I mean, he said it's just the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. And so in those cases, it can be, all these 15 things. But the kinds of things people say are that they often hear the doctor or nurse or somebody else say, "Oh my God, he's dead," or "We've lost her," or words to that effect. But one comment I've heard all over the world, Brent, from people is the common theme of this is, I have never been so alive as when I heard that doctor say I was dead. Because people say that suddenly there is a total whirl around of the world. And they say it's like you find yourself out of your body, up above this scene, and watching the resuscitation from above. And these people generally say it's not that they hear what the doctors or nurses are saying, but they become aware of what the doctors and nurses are thinking. But that when they try to communicate in turn, they try to say, what is this? Nobody seems to be able to see them or hear them. They say that at some point they become aware of this passageway. They may call it a tunnel or hallway or whatever, but they go down this tunnelway and come out in the other side into incredibly brilliant and warm and loving light. People say that, no matter what experience of love you've had on this life is hardly comparable. This is just amazing. And in that light, they say that relatives or friends of yours have already passed away are there to welcome you into this. At a certain point, everything else kind of disappears, and say that time stands still early in this. And they say at some point they are surrounded by a panorama, which consists of every single detail of their lives displayed around them. And they say that in this panorama, you see each detail of your life, but you see it not just from the perspective you had when you did each action, but rather you feel it empathically from the perspective of the person with whom you've interacted. So if you see yourself doing a mean-spirited thing, then you feel the sadness on the other person's part. Or if you see yourself doing something good to something, then you feel the good things. But this is and all over in an instant. And people say that it's like an eternity, but actually that no time passes, but you see everything. And often they say that in the process of this, they are in the presence of what they call a being of light, like a personal being who sees this review with them, knows everything about them, and sort of is in a helping position of helping them to understand this. It's not like a judgmental thing. It's like a discussion of this, and this being. Some say Christ, some say God, some say an angel, some just say a being of light. But this complete compassion and discusses your life, the paths you took, and so on. And so what? And I have, I've chased knowledge all my life. I had 2 doctoral degrees plus 3 years of teaching in a university before I was 31. And everybody my age now can know there's something terribly wrong with a person like that, right? And there was, I was chased. Some people chase money, some people chase fame, some people what power. My chasing was knowledge. And whatever they were chasing, people who go through this experience of having their whole life reviewed say that what comes out of this is that what this is all about is learning to love. It's to say that that's what it's all about. It's like people say that they're not words, but it's as though the question comes not in words, but the question is something like, how have you learned to love? And that's what this review is all about. Also, incidentally, people have told me for decades, people say that in scenes in which they had been learning something, that this being would kind of zero in on that, and the thought would come, as I've heard from many people, that that's interesting, that you're learning this. And the follow-up thought is that this process will not stop when you die. And my friend George Ritchie, who was the first living person I heard this from, said he is, from what he saw, he said that the process of learning, he said, I gather, goes on, he said, quite literally for eternity. And so that's what people experience. How did they get back? Some people say, I have no idea. One moment I was in this light, next moment I was back on the hospital bed. Others say that they were told they have to go back. It's not your time yet. Like somebody says, you got to go back. You haven't finished something. So they're sent back. Yet others are given a choice. And they say that, they were said, the person they're with them says, well, you can either stay in this experience you're having or go back to the life you've been leading. And obviously all the ones I've taught chose to go back. But what is so interesting about this is almost every one of them is the same reason, which I understand very well. Say, not for me, but I have children left to raise, is the typical thing they say. Or sometimes it's to go back to help somebody else.
Paul,
and
question.
These things powerfully express, these experiences powerfully change people.
Yeah. And that was my next question to you, Paul, because I know you've done a lot of research with multiple different physicians that have had these kind of experiences or worked with people that have had these experiences. What you're both describing to me sounds like A Christmas Carol, where Scrooge is seeing almost the potential outcome based on the decisions he's making today. And I can't imagine.
You've got it backwards, though. The Christmas Carol came from these.
Well, yeah, there you go. Exactly. So, I mean, what kind of transformations have you seen with people having navigated this world for decades now after having these experiences?
Well, there's an enormous transformation. We did a study. I was involved in a study that Melvin Morse did called the Transformation Study. And we looked at hundreds of people who had near-death experiences. to see how the experience had transformed them from a very early age. So some of the people were children, and now in the course of this study, they're in their 40s and 50s. Or we would, study people who were later along in life. And what we found is that people who have NDEs have a higher zest for living. In other words, they're type A without the anger. They have a higher intelligence, and I think that's related to their sudden interest. Their interests have opened up, primarily through a near-death experience. They have a greater appreciation for learning. On a more paranormal angle, they have an increase in psychic abilities, which means that people who have near-death experiences have 4 times the number of verifiable psychic experiences as people who have not had near-death experiences. And
how would that compare to empathy? What would a psychic experience be versus empathy? Because you've been through something traumatic, you're feeling things in a deeper level. But what do you mean by psychic experiences?
Oh, well, they're verifiable psychic experiences. So it would be ones that we could definitely prove. So as an extreme one, it would be someone who had a dream at night and that the plane they were going to take the next day was going to crash. They get up, they tell their spouse or someone else that, hey, I'm not going to fly because I had this dream that the plane crashed, and then it does. I mean, that's definitely a verifiable psychic experiences. And it's at the extreme end. There's others that are, in the middle as well. So they're different from empathy.
Yeah.
We made sure that they were different from empathy.
And in terms of, do they come out, for lack of sounding, I guess, simplistic, do they come out generally as better people?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can make a comment on that, having known some of these people literally for decades.
Right.
And that is, Brent, it's that one thing they say is my dear friend George Ritchie, who was the finest person I ever knew, one day stopped by my house urgently to tell me, he said, it took me years to see the point of the message, but he said, Raymond, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. Now, George said things very kindly, but I've heard this same sentiment expressed by many other people in various words. So let me, trim it down to a few words, which is that, let's face it, it's very difficult to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. And that is the reality, isn't it, for most of us, right? And so what people say is, yeah, I still have that, right? I still fly off the handle. But what this vision or the realization of seeing everything you've done kind of from the other person's perspective, it does definitely temper that. And George told me that. And George used to wake up. George would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, every morning, to pray and meditate before he would go and see his psychiatry patients.
Hmm.
And I've known other people like that who have gone on these extraordinary spiritual disciplines and so on, which is still required. The great William James, who studied the psychology of spiritual experiences, said that he had noticed there were 2 main ways to get on the spiritual path. He said, it's like overnight, like you have a mystical experience, like Saint somebody, or like Zoom one night and this overnight. But he said, for most of us, it's more like this, right? Like ups and downs. And since I had already known that observation by William James when I first started out researching this, it has, what I've observed over the years is that people with near-death experience, it's a combination of those 2 things. That on the one hand, they have the Zoom, they're there. And that forever after, there's a kind of longing or nostalgia for that place that I hear from these people.
Let me
But
ask
at
you.
the same time, you come back and it's a process of learning here how to do that.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you both this, because a skeptic may say, okay, as you mentioned before, Raymond, that oxygen deprivation, it's a very subjective experience. Now, Paul, you talked about verifiable psychic experiences, which is a little bit different. But what I think is so fascinating about your current book is that you're diving into this idea of a shared death experience, because now you're getting somebody that isn't physically massively compromised enough to potentially be dead, that is participating in this death experience almost. So what is, again, tell us about a shared experience, what that even is.
Well, for 30 years, we worked together on books and projects about near-death experiences. And one conclusion we came to is that a near-death experience is largely a subjective experience, that one person has it, and they're really the only person that can convey what it was like to have this and to explain the effects of it. But then we started to collect stories that we called shared death experiences, which is when a living person who is well shares the death experience of someone who is dying. And that intrigued us mostly because it's an objective experience. You know, it's being had by more than one person, sometimes quite a few people at the same time. And that is a shared death experience, and it leads us more to the proof that consciousness has left the body, and consciousness can survive outside of the body.
Yeah, and all of these things that we think of as the near-death experience, like getting out of the body, ascending toward a light, and seeing apparitions of the dying person, and are part also of these shared death experiences. Like people at the bedside say, as grandma died, I got out of my body and I went upward with her partway toward this light. Or people say, I saw the apparition of Aunt Ruth come into the room as my grandma was dying, or the room fills with light. And most remarkably to me, and this is something that I must say is the most troubling thing I know in all my studies of this, is that it happens regularly enough that you can find cases of this, that the bystander at the death of someone else empathically co-lives the dying life review of
Wow.
the person who passes away. And to me, this is shocking, and number one, a little bit scary, because I've tried to figure out some way to recuse myself from my own life review, much less the idea that there would be a spectator there, right? But it's astonishing. And for years I thought, well, this has to be somebody very intimate with the person who's dying, right? I mean, but then some years ago, my wife and I got a communication from ER doctor who was called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on. And as this guy was dying, the man's life review sprang up around him. I've even had this lady from Canada whose grandfather was a farmer. And as he was dying, unbeknownst to her, in the hospital, right, she saw his scenes of his life in review as he was dying, as she later found out. So, this is some hard stuff to put together. But I think it's very important for the big questions you were asking earlier, Brent, like, what are we? Where did we come from here? Or what is this all about that we're going through?
Well, one question I would have for both of you as well is, I think that, my father, for example, who's 84 years old, describes when he was a young kid, maybe 5, 6 years old, when his grandparents died, they would die at home, and we've really medicalized both birth, babies are generally born in hospitals now, at least in the West, and death. And so it's not surprising to me that a lot of the physicians that you have both interviewed and worked with are the people and the nurses that are on the front lines of seeing this stuff. But do you think that the fact that this is maybe a little bit of a side question, the fact that we've medicalized living and dying, birth and living and dying, I think it's caused an enormous amount of fear about the whole process of life and death. Would you guys share that based on your studies?
Oh, I think that's very true. I make a kind of a example of it would be I was speaking to a friend of mine whose whose father had died. She's Mormon, and her father died in Utah, and she went back for the funeral. And at the funeral were all of her aunts, and they were sitting around talking about other people in the family who had died and how they had had shared death experiences at their bedside, and they had taken care of them. They cared for them at home. That's all gone now, for the most part, and it does. I think it does create fear in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I do. I'm just, it's the attitudes of societies toward death is something that's largely beyond my control. Perhaps for good reason, that I'm not sure I'd know how to figure it out myself, but I do know the system we have of, is has its deficits compared to what I know of the times when people died at home. And that was that people had these experiences that they see of the things that are now just sound nonsense to talk about, but which were common knowledge back at 150 years ago, that as people die, they light up. They if they've been obtunded for weeks, they suddenly are just like they were before, but better. And they shine with a light. I know it sounds crazy, but you ask anybody in hospice who's worked with the terminally ill for a long time. Yeah, it happens. And what is that all about? Or people who sing as they are dying.
Well, let
Two
me ask you.
people in my own limited association network sang their way out when they died. I mean, and it's fairly common, and not as common as near-death experiences, but common enough that you can study it.
Well, you give me a great segue into your seven proofs. Your seven proofs that there's a consciousness that exists beyond this life, and it's based on these shared death experiences. And so you touched on the first one, which is obviously people that are around the person that dying is sharing these out of body experiences and sharing perhaps they had a visit of a loved one or the tunnel or the light. And the second reason you had is what you guys term as precognitive experiences. Will you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, precognitive experiences when well, a good example would be if you're asleep one night, and you wake up and there's someone, we'll say a family member, standing at the end of the bed, and they say, I'm passing away. See you later. And yet they were never ill. No one expected them to die. And that is precognition, is that that something is going to happen before it happens. That's fairly common. You run into that quite a bit.
Now, are these happening at you have a loved one that maybe is several miles away or thousands of miles away. Is it as
Sure.
they are passing, or is it something that we're talking about months in advance?
No, it appears to be as they are passing. I mean, we found some studies done in the 19th century of people who were in China, and their family members back in England, like in one case, two nieces back in England had a dream that their uncle had died in China. He wasn't ill. They didn't expect him to die. And then later they got communication from the people he worked for in China that he indeed had died, and he had died on that particular date that they had their dreams. So yeah, it can happen all over the place.
Yeah. And Brent, I think one thing that so many people learn as they grow older, my wife, for instance, is just beyond brilliant. I mean, it's like with an embarrassingly high IQ, okay? But she's totally non-intellectual, which is great for me. She studied art, okay? But I studied philosophy, and I was studying when I was 18 that, yeah, there's something fishy about the notion of time. But several years ago, Cheryl and I were standing in the living room, and I said she looked very reflective, like she's looking far, far away. And she said, time is unreal. And I said, yeah, and it's, if you get involved in the workaday world, but once you start reflecting, Aristotle said, what is time? He said, it's past, present, and future. He said, but the past doesn't exist. The future doesn't exist. And try holding on to the present, poof. So, it's a very fishy thing. And I think that what comes to the fore with these people with near death experiences is that they say, yeah, this is time is an illusion, kind of. Our friend, Eben Alexander, who's a professor at Harvard of neurosurgery for 14 years and had a near death experience. But I was asking Eben, I said, in the world we're in, the two axes of orientation are time and space. But what people say about these near death experiences is that it's not time or space. So I said to Eben, I said, what are the orienting axes? And he said, it's love and knowledge, which is just a wholly different orientation system.
No kidding, that's for sure.
Now, and what's kind of amazing about this book, because we've talked about doctors a lot, is the number of doctors that now talk about these experiences, whether they've happened to them or they've happened to their patients. So back years ago, when I was writing my first book with Raymond, I was also writing a book on reversing heart disease with a cardiologist in Cleveland. And I was visiting him, and he said, well, what else are you working on? I told him about the near-death experience book, and he shook his head and said, I've resuscitated hundreds of people, and I've never, ever heard anyone talk about a near-death experience. So he was called away from the nurses' station where we were talking, and the nurses came over, and they said, well, that's because he never talks to his patients. He never asks them questions. That's a big difference that now it's in Raymond's work has put it into the lexicon.
Well, the two of you must have been viewed as almost these fringe, I don't want to say fringe lunatics, but definitely the weird guys out there talking about this stuff when it started.
Pretty good.
Brent, it makes me sound like a hero to say, oh, Dr. Moody was persecuted by the medical community and all like that. But the reality is it never happened. Now, I had been studying this for 10 years and talking about it as a philosophy professor before I went to medical school. And I was from Georgia, where I went to medical school. I had friends there. My professors knew before I came in that the student was coming in September who had studied these experiences. Within the first 2 weeks, Brent, 8 of my professors had called and said, Dr. Moody, thank you for studying this. About half of them said, because it happened to me. And then others said, I've heard this from my patients. And then just a few months later, my wonderful psychiatry professor, she later became told me that she had this experience of leaving her body and seeing from above, and as she was trying unsuccessfully to resuscitate her mother, and she saw this passageway open. So this is something that is hard to put together in the common sense view of the world that we're all obliged to subscribe to, because that's how it holds together.
But it really comes together when someone names and defines an experience, which Raymond did with the near-death experience. So he names and defines it, and it becomes a door that they can open and tell their story, to people. Because up until that time, there was really no definition for it. And it wasn't recognized really by the medical establishment. But then it got out into the public, and now the people in the public, patients, would start to ask more questions of their doctors. The doctors start to acknowledge their own experiences, and here we are now, where doctors openly speak about it.
Yeah. There's one topic that you discuss in the current book as well that to me is, for some reason, this one's very comforting to me. Terminal lucidity.
Oh, yeah.
Will you guys talk about that and what some of your experience has been in researching that?
Well, terminal lucidity is defined as a flash of life that takes place shortly before a person dies. So an example would be that I saw one time before it was even named or defined. My son, my oldest son, broke his femur in a motorcycle accident, and I was going to the hospital to see him every day. One day I went to the hospital and they moved a man in who was sort of in the end stages of dementia, and he was in the room across the hall from my son. And a day or so later, his family was visiting him. He was out of bed. He was literally standing on his bed. He seemed to be just perfectly fine. There were 7 members of his family. He spoke to each one of them about his life, about what was going to be theirs when he died, about his business, and they were enthralled at the thought that he had been healed, that somehow his dementia had reversed. And then the next day when I came to see my son, his bed was empty and he had passed away during the night. That's a common path in terminal lucidity.
Yeah. And in the old days, Brent, the times that you were talking about when people died at home, before all this system got started, people were very aware of this, and there was a common name for it. The name was FEY, which is in the middle definition in the Oxford English Dictionary. But what it means is a heightened state of consciousness that portends imminent death. And people just knew that even if somebody's been absconded and out of touch for weeks, that they have this rally at the end sometime where and the funny thing is I've seen this because I dealt with the terminally ill, and anybody who's seen worked with the terminally ill a lot will tell you this, but that they will also acknowledge that it sounds so unbelievable, but this is what happens. People, it's like grandma has been inaccessible for weeks, and everybody's just standing around waiting till she dies. And all of a sudden, grandma comes back to life. And yeah, there's a light, but it's not coming from the sun or from a light bulb. It's like this clarity to it. And they become almost like they're enlightened. I mean, I don't know what word to use, but one of the common things you see, and it's happened in my case to my father and to my uncle, who died, also had this same thing, that they go around and they give a message to everybody.
Right.
My uncle, not only to his kids and wife who were there at the bedside, but to all of us, an individual message.
And it's
And
biblical
after
too. Old Testament talks about that, about the blessings of the blessings of patriarch or matriarch when they depart. This is, it is something through history.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, let me ask you both this: so you've been spending decades now doing this kind of research. How has this changed each of you personally and individually?
Take it away, boss.
Dr. Moody, what do you think? How has this changed your
Well,
own personal worldview?
I started life, I wanted to be an astronomer and a comedian. And the life, even Afterlife was totally unreal to me. And now I've been through a process where and not with any religious background to bring to this but have been just compelled by a process to say, I surrender. I realize as a professor of logic the difficulties of making a logical inference about this. But when some of my best friends, who happen to be also medical doctors, whose medical judgment I would trust 100%, tell me that, I imagine if I had some injury to my foot, heaven forbid, because I'm a addicted walker, right? And to me, it's so hard to think of hurting my foot. If I did, when I go to Anthony Chicoria, my osteo, my surgery professor at NYU, isn't it? Orthopedic surgery at NYU, and who had a near-death experience in 1994 who tells me, yeah, not only was it real, but it was more real than real. Or Eben Alexander, or any number of physicians I know personally whose medical judgment I completely trust, unanimously tell me that what they experienced was not just real, but more real than this. And so, see, I just give up. I can't think my way out of it. So that's how I reached where I am, including, for example, seeing my friend Jeff O'Driscoll is an emergency room doctor. Okay, and Jeff was in the hospital and the ER when Jeff Olson, who was owner of a design company, advertising, and Jeff Olson was in a horrible car crash in which his leg was just amputated by the accident, I gather. And he was having his wife was killed instantly. One of his children was killed, and as I recall, one survived. And so while he was taken to the hospital, and while he was in the room surrounded by all these tubes, Jeff O'Driscoll went in and saw and talked with the dead wife of Jeff Olson. And then as this developed, the nurse on the ward said, yeah, well, it happened to me too. So you see, at a certain point, this is just, I don't know how to work my way out of these things, especially in an era where this is becoming almost common sense. And what you both will find, by the way, as you grow older, a greater and greater percentage of your friends your age will have had some sort of experience of stepping over into some other reality. So what I've come to see is this reality that we're in, it's not as it seems. This is a very, very complex story. So,
you were giving me kind of a segue into a comment, Paul, that you made when you guys recently did the interview with Coast to Coast. And I'm going to paraphrase it here, of course, but there's this idea of the burden or the weight of life, but the fact that we are bombarded with millions upon millions and millions of bits of data.
Sure.
And maybe there is something about this experience that strips all the rest of it away, and you're getting to something closer to the essence. Do you think that's potentially what's occurring?
Yeah, and there's actually some studies to back that up. There was a study that was done in Resuscitation magazine this last month. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, where they spoke to 50-some people who had very deep cardiac arrest, which means they were essentially dead. They had deep cardiac arrest in that they had no more EKG and no EEG, no brain waves or heart waves. And yet they came back after a period of time, some as long as 2 hours later. And they described what they felt like was just, and there were no brakes on their brains. How's that? Is that many people think that there's a filter that keeps us from being exposed to all the input that we get in a day. You know, input just hits us like grains of sand, and we can't experience it all. We can't examine it all. But they say that goes away when they die. And they then opened up to all kinds of things. The things they opened up to mirror near-death experience. They had out-of-body experiences. They had they could see all and know all, which is what happens to people who have NDEs as well. And they felt that their minds had been opened up. And then
opened up to, I guess, a realm far greater than what we've got here.
So that's what they're talking about, though, is not having a filter, which we have now. The filter makes us function better, but it also keeps a lot of information from us.
Interesting. Well, guys, again, the book is Proof of Life After Life, 7 Reasons to Believe There's an Afterlife. It's one of several books about near-death experiences, shared death experiences, a lot of this different information that the two of you have worked with together, and that, Paul, that you've done with some other physicians as well. Heartily recommend it. Is there any other way that people that are getting very interested in this, or maybe you're listening to this conversation today dealing with the loss of a loved one and are finding a lot of comfort in what you're saying. What would each of you suggest are good next steps to explore this and try to educate themselves on this topic?
Well, I have my website is lifeafterlife.com,
Mhm.
and I'm particularly open to talking with people about grief. That's one thing I do. I lost my first child at the age of 36 hours in 1970. And so I know full well that feeling people have. You're never going to get over it, but it's a process. So one of the things I've done in my practice as a psychiatrist a lot is grief therapy or other things. And so the way to get in touch with me is lifeafterlife.com.
And Paul, how do people become more acquainted with a lot of the work that you've done, both with Dr. Moody and also with a lot of other professionals?
It's paulperryproductions.com. That's my website. Or glimpsesofeternity.com. And that's a book site.
Well, guys, this has been awesome. And again, I really thank you. I know you're on a very busy schedule of making a lot of different rounds, chatting with a few people. And again, to our listeners, these guys have written books that have sold how many? 20 million copies, I think, discussing these issues.
I
hope
think
this does the same.
I think, Paul, I heard recently that Life After Life has sold 20 million copies. I've heard
So
of
just that
it.
book.
Just that book alone has sold 20 million. Yeah.
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 So I appreciate you carving time out of your day to have a discussion with me and my audience and Bill about this. So thank you so much.
And thanks so much for the folks listening in. I really appreciate your
Yeah. Thanks,
listening.
Brent. Thanks for bringing us on. It's a different audience for us, but it's a good audience.
Absolutely.
It is a fascinating conversation. This podcast could go on for another hour or 2 hours. Actually, it's really great. If you don't mind, a couple of really quick observations. One, you've made me feel sane because I've argued for many, many years that time is an artifice that we humans have constructed in order to deal with our past, present, and future. And the other thing that strikes me in this conversation is that especially in the shared near-death experiences or afterlife experiences, is the fact you cannot deny, as much as you may want to, we're all connected.
Yeah.
Sure. There's definitely that. There's a lot of things you can't deny from these, and that's one of them.
That's right.
I think it's really, I've spent a lot of time just in meditation thinking about time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's drives me nuts. But, yeah, you know what I mean? Because you keep saying, well, it doesn't exist, but then it does. And how does it exist for us is a different reality than how it exists for the universe.
What is it?
Yeah.
Immanuel Kant, his comment was that it doesn't really exist external to us, that it's part of our cognitive mechanism. It's like it's the basis of our experience. It's like the form of our experience of life, but not something that's external to us.
Right.
Wow.
But it's also preeminent in our culture. I mean, our whole lives are just in many ways ruled by time.
And no question. And increasingly so. There's no question
You
about it.
think go back to 1823.
Yeah.
200 years ago. People were governed by the sky. Think about it. Then, and just within a few decades, people started governing themselves by the clock.
Yeah.
And there is a schism in our sleep process because of this. If you go back to ancient writings, you'll hear all this stuff about during the first awakening, we did this or that. And
that's
what that
a whole interesting topic there that I think about often.
It is, yeah. And as people would kind of go to sleep when the sun went down, then about midnight they'd wake up, they'd do something, just read or talk, and then they'd go back to sleep. That's how people always did it until clocks.
Yeah, and you figure that the technological advances that just in the last 50 years, let alone a couple hundred years that we've made, and you wonder again. I think about that in terms of being around birth and life and sickness and dying. We've we've really isolated ourselves from both natural cycles. I live here in the desert in Arizona. It could be 120 degrees out. I'm 72 degrees and cool in my office. Around, being around our parents, because in many cases we're physically separated from a great deal of distance. We're used to be all together. Communities are now increasingly, what we're doing right now is virtual, and these tools are amazing. But I do wonder what aspect of our humanity have we given up for these amazing magic shows that we have, that we get to engage with every single day? And I don't know the answer to that.
It's interesting. It's a big thing. I mean, where this is headed, nobody can tell, but it's so huge. I remember, Brent, probably before you were born, I was watching the television. This was about 1954 or something. And
long time before I was born, Doctor.
okay, and at my grandmother's house, I was watching the TV. This was in midday. And the two people you don't even know, one was named Arthur Godfrey, and the other one was named Gary Moore. And they were big television celebrities, right? And they both, their shows were all the time. And Gary Moore, I Got a Secret, the daily Godfrey show. And so one day, is this the way they do it now? It's like this was beginning that. Of course, Gary Moore one day was a guest on Arthur Godfrey's show.
Yeah.
And so Arthur and Gary Moore had his hair stood up. It was like a crew cut and stood up straight. But as he was telling this story, his eyes were so huge that it accentuated that. It made him look like an exclamation point. And he was telling this story about what had happened to him like a day or two before, as he was telling it. He said he had gone down to the marina where he keeps his boat. And he said he saw a complete stranger walking on the deck of his boat. And he said, as he got up to this guy, the stranger jumped down, grabbed his hands. Gary, I see you on TV all the time. I heard this was your boat. And Gary Moore was incomprehending. See, we understand that now so much better than he did, because he was in the process. There was not, the power of TV was not evident yet.
Right.
Right. And it was so incomprehensible to him.
Yeah.
Now, what is this thing we're in now? What going to do to us? See, there's no way of telling.
I don't know, and I know we're going a little over time, but I'm willing to continue the dialogue if you guys are. I do have the question for you, because I really, and this might be veering somewhat off topic here, but I've got this, love-hate thing with the technology and this sort of digital virtual world that we're in. I think it leverages things. It leverages your time. It can leverage relationships, because we're in 4 different places right now. We're having this conversation. But how do you think, because I would say that the two of you have quite a bit of insight into humanity and human living and dying through the work that you've done over several decades. Is there a way that you think that this world that we're moving into, this increasingly virtual digital world, how do you think it's going to work out? I know that's a loaded question and who knows, but what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, for one thing, we can be instantly connected with anyone in the world and then instantly disconnected. So I think we're missing a lot by not dealing with each other personally. And of course, we can't help but not deal with someone personally if they're in Iceland and we're here. But there's a move, I think, to not deal with each other personally, even if you're close.
Yeah.
I don't know if people rarely meet for lunch now, but that used to be the big social event. I think people are now doing Zoom calls, which is it's an interesting thing, but it's extremely disconnected, if you will.
I have all my life, I've been very good at extrapolating. I'm not talking about, fortune telling or psychic. I'm talking about just figuring out where things are going. I mean, I've done it so many times, but I'm at a state where I can't figure out where this is headed. But it looks to me like it's headed up towards some big event. But what that is, I cannot not even imagine.
Hmm.
It seems like to me there will be a crunch point where this thing we're in can't hold together anymore.
What do
Well,
you
we
mean?
have,
Expand on that.
yeah.
It's just too complex.
Mm,
I mean, you know, I see that I have two doctoral degrees, an MD and a PhD in philosophy, and I can't even. And I read books all the time. I watch the news, and I am totally incapable of figuring what's going on out. And so I think of all those people that we all grew up with who heard that thing about, well, you know, when you graduate from high school, you can get a job at the factory or the, you know, and then you can have your pension and that will all work. And
Oh,
and
God.
imagine them trying to figure this out. If I can't even begin to comprehend what this thing is, then I feel so much sympathy for the people who, because often people in that situation are kind of thinking, well, I can't figure it out, but somebody can. See,
Yeah.
but I'm in a situation where I realize that no, I don't think anybody can.
Well,
Well, I
part of
think
the stress point is, I think, there's a large population that are pushing for the old way, and there's a large population pulling for the new way. And I think there's definite, you know, definite difference in the two, visible difference. The old way, I mean, look at UAW, they're trying to go back to the old way,
mm,
you know, with the pensions and the mother company, that kind of thing. And then other people are pressing forward, the Silicon Valley people press forward to an increasingly digital world.
it's interesting. I think my big concern is one of the great books is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And what it comes down to is if you have a purpose and a reason for existing, and that can
That's
be
right.
different for everyone, that's a
Sure.
reason to get up in the morning. And I think the thing
Yeah.
that concerns me most is that, Paul, you even talked about the UAW strike, which is happening right now. There used to be dignity in that man that went to work on the line and was
Correct.
building. He could point to that car and say to his son, hey, I made that. And he found purpose and meaning in that. He did with his family, he did with his faith belief, whatever that might be. And what I don't like happening in society, we're getting way off topic, but this idea that you're atomizing people, you know, you're basically taking people and you're breaking them down into these individual little things that fit into this widget, and not really looking at them holistically in terms of how they can relate and how they can participate in the whole. And I think that's where the real danger is. It's not you look at our country, they've obviously very divided economically, politically, in a lot of different ways. But to me, the great divide is, are you an atomized being that has no useful purpose, is just here taking up oxygen and doesn't have a purpose for living? Or are you here for a reason? And I'm personally, I think it's to learn and grow and have an experience. If you ask me why I think we're here, that's kind of why I think we're here.
Yeah.
But I think we're in a real dangerous world when you've got two vastly different trajectories like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One
Anyway,
energizing the other.
okay, guys. Again, I kept you late. I could continue this conversation for a long time, and I'm lucky because Paul's, my father-in-law, so we can continue this later on. He only lives a few miles from me, so it's good. And
You can
Dr. Moody
tap these
again.
guys in too.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And, Raymond, while you were talking, and I'll use this as a way of wrapping it up, when you were talking about you're not sure what's coming, it reminded me of a poem by one of my favorite poets, which is William Butler Yeats, called The Second Coming. And and I'm just going to quote a couple of lines, and they're really fast. Third line is, things fall apart. The sinner cannot hold. And the second stanza says, surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. So on that note, I think we can wrap this really fascinating episode up, and where it takes us from here, I don't know. But Brent, thank you for putting this all together. For the people who've been listening to this and thinking, this Brent guy is kind of interesting, I would like to have further contact with him. How do they get in touch with you?
Well, we do talk about a lot of other stuff as well. It's a little bit less esoteric than what we discussed here today. But yeah, our number here in the office is 602-255-0555. Either Susan or Andy or Kayla, a member of my team, will pick up, or I'll pick up as well. But one of the things that I absolutely love about my business, and I do think it's a different discussion, obviously, than if you're doing succession planning or something in your business, is that all of this stuff that we're doing, it involves life and living and what you're trying to do with your time here. And I think that our discussion today, obviously, is a deep exploration of what happens after our time here. But I'd love to have a conversation with anyone that just found the conversation we had here with Dr. Moody and with Paul and with you, Bill, interesting. And if you want just to keep expanding on that, I'm happy to have that conversation as well.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening to this podcast. If you are not a subscriber, hit the subscribe button. Clearly, there's plenty of reason to subscribe to this podcast. And this way you don't have to remember where you heard it or how you found it or when the next one comes out, because as a subscriber, you're automatically notified when Brent has a new edition of the podcast out. We also would ask that if you like it, rate it and share it with others and help spread the word about the podcast. On behalf of Brent and everybody at MP Advisors, thank you very much for listening. And if nothing else from this episode today, remember this: don't wait. Live your best life today. Thank you. That was